What they found beneath Jesus' tomb shocked science. Historic discovery. They pried back centuries of stone and dust, and for the first time in generations, a buried architecture revealed itself in the dim heart of one of Christianity's most venerated places. On October 26th, a team of conservators and archaeologists began a careful, painstaking work, peeling away a marble shroud that had protected an inner shrine for centuries. And what lay beneath was at once fragile, unmistakably ancient, and unexpectedly intact. That moment, when light touched the inner face of the structure, triggered a cascade of scientific surprise. Not a single dramatic certificate of faith, but a confluence of material evidence so suggestive and well-preserved that veteran specialists said they had not anticipated such clarity. If you're fascinated by the meeting point of history and belief, like and subscribe to follow more investigations like this. The place is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, a compound that has been layered, rebuilt, adorned and contested across nearly 2,000 years. Pilgrims, kings and emperors have marked and remade it. A Roman-era shrine, later a Hadrianic temple, Constantine's 4th century basilica and its mosaic splendors, periods of destruction, reconstruction and devotional addition under Byzantine, Crusader, Fatimid and Ottoman histories. For centuries, the faithful have venerated a small aedicule inside the church as the tomb of Jesus. For scholars and archaeologists, that tradition raised a set of hard questions. How much of the place preserved elements visible to the 1st century landscape? Had later constructions moved, covered or replaced the original features? Could any material trace survive beneath the marble and mortar of a structure visited and rebuilt so often? The excavation that began on October 26 and continued through October 28 set out not to answer theological certainties, but to document physical layers. Specialists approached the work as surgeons rather than treasure hunters, conservators with scalpels of metal and patience, archaeologists with measured brushes, photographers with calibrated lighting, and scientists ready to sample soil, seeds, and pollen. Over 60 hours, they removed filler materials, documented stratigraphy, and exposed an interior stone surface that had not seen daylight for centuries. At first, the team encountered a modern and late medieval accretion, a filler that had been used in recent repairs, lime and mortar between the marble slabs. Beneath that filler, the next layer produced a small but evocative clue, a slab bearing a faint incised cross. The carving was subtle, weathered by time, but its presence changed the tenor of the work from restoration to archaeological inquiry. Following the cross came what stunned several members of the team: an intact limestone funerary bed, a worked slab that appears to be the original burial bench or bench-like bedding cut from the living rock. The limestone surface was not a fragment. It was a coherent funerary surface, complete enough to be documented, sampled and photographed in fine detail. It's the kind of discovery you rarely get in a site that has been so continuously visited and modified, said Frederick Hyatt, describing his astonishment at seeing a worked limestone bed exposed within the inner shrine. Hyatt, who has worked in Jerusalem's archaeology for years, emphasized that preservation on this scale inside a heavily venerated building was unexpected. He and others repeatedly qualified their language. This discovery does not and cannot deliver definitive proof of any single identity, but the combination of elements is compelling and demands careful interpretation. Professor Antonia Moropoulou, the supervising scientific conservator, led the documentation of the exposed surfaces. She and her team photographed every angle, recorded details of tool marks and wear patterns, and collected microsamples where appropriate for later laboratory analysis. We documented, we sampled as little as necessary, and we resealed. Moropoulou said, describing the ethical calculus that governs conservation work at living religious sites where access must be balanced against preservation. Her concern was not only the scientific value of the stone, but also the responsibility to custodians, worshippers, and an international scholarly community. The exposed rock face inside the edicule revealed more than a worked bench. There were traces of ancient tool marks along the vertical rock, faint graffiti, and marks that a close epigraphic and graffiti survey suggested might be early devotional additions. Martin Vidal, the archaeologist who documented the rock surface, pointed to these marks as evidence that the site had been visited and marked across a long sequence of devotion. Such graffiti, crosses, small incisions, and other marks do not, by themselves, settle historical questions. Noted Vidal, they are one more thread in a tapestry of material behavior that connects worship, memory, and place. The surprises did not stop within the edicule. In a separate phase of fieldwork beneath a different part of the church compound, excavations exposed what seems to be an ancient, remarkably well-preserved garden, a cultivated area that had lain sealed under rubble and later construction. Professor Francesca, who led that garden excavation, described layers of compacted soil containing seeds, olive pits, vine remains, and pollen. These botanical remains, some macroscopic like olive pits and small seeds, and others microscopic like pollen grains, offer a biological record of plant life and cultivation practices on the site. Palynological analysis, pollen study, provided a spectrum of species consistent with Mediterranean horticulture and cultivation in antiquity. The presence of planted beds, edging stones, and in situ botanical remains suggests intentional cultivation, not random growth. Olive pits and vine residues point to cultivated species common in first-century Jewish and Roman horticulture, and the pattern of planting beds implies a garden of design or purpose. Whether this garden was domestic, commemorative, or ritual in function remains an open question, but its preservation offers an extraordinary opportunity to reconstruct the environmental context of the site. Jody Magness, an archaeologist who commented on the botanical finds, emphasized that the combination of seeds, soil stratigraphy, and pollen provides a data set that can be dated and contextualized without relying on devotional narratives. Underneath that garden, excavators found a cluster of rock-cut tombs. These tombs are cut directly into the bedrock, with burial niches and architectural features consistent with Jewish burial customs and elite tomb architecture of the late Second Temple period. The arrangement and style of these tombs, along with the garden above them, match a pattern archaeologists expect around first-century Jerusalem. Burial grounds placed outside the city walls and gardened enclosures nearby. Dan Bahat, the former city archaeologist of Jerusalem, observed that the cemetery pattern aligns with descriptions and legal prescriptions of the time. Burials outside the urban core, often accompanied by cultivated land nearby, whether for symbolic cultivation or pragmatic horticulture. If the material sequence worked funerary bed within a marked edicule, an adjacent ancient garden with Mediterranean flora, and a lower rock-cut cemetery were found independently, each would be interesting but not decisive. Together, they form a convergence of lines of evidence, a funerary installation inside a venerated structure, horticultural remains that match textual images of a garden, and a cemetery context consistent with first-century burial customs. The convergence does not equate to proof that a particular historical individual was interred here, but it does make the site a heavyweight claimant in the long debate over location and continuity. To understand why these findings matter, it helps to step back into the historical texts and traditions that have defined this place. The Gospels provide a set of spatial and ritual references. John 19:41 describes a garden and a tomb nearby. Matthew 27:60 notes the burial in a new tomb, and Mark 15:46 records the placing of a body in a tomb. These textual motifs have long been read as compatible with a garden burial outside the city walls. Yet the Gospels do not offer architectural blueprints, and centuries of change have obscured the physical landscape. What archaeologists must weigh are three things: the physical record, the sequence of later construction and renovation, and the ways in which tradition has preserved memory, even if transformed by later devotion. History complicates that weighing. In the 2nd century, the Roman Emperor Hadrian built a temple on this general ridge. Christian tradition insists that Constantine later established a basilica in the 4th century, and written accounts from Eusebius and other early writers describe a memorialization of Christian holy places. Yet the site saw cycles of destruction and repair, Crusader rebuilds, Byzantine reconfigurations, and medieval repairs, all layered stone over stone. Even so, some early elements, fragments of mosaic, foundations, and reused masonry, survive among later additions. Archaeologists must read those layers as an architectural palimpsest. Each layer both preserves and obscures what came before. Scientific methods used in the excavation reflect that caution. Stratigraphic observation, reading the sequence of deposits and construction phases, help teams distinguish modern filler from medieval mortar and older compacted soils. Photography and high-resolution documentation recorded surfaces and tool marks before any sampling. Microsampling of stone, soil, and botanical material allowed palynologists and archaeobotanists to carry out pollen and seed analysis in specialized labs. Carbon dating of organic samples can, when applicable, provide date ranges. Pollen spectra can suggest vegetation patterns and even human activity such as cultivation. The team emphasized that none of these methods singly can prove historical identification. Each yields probabilistic data that must be read within a broader interpretive framework. Expert caution remained a constant thread. What we can say is that the funerary bed and the garden are consistent with descriptions of burial and memorial practice in the 1st century, said Jody Magnes, urging restraint where enthusiasm might otherwise leap to theological certainty. Frederick Hirt echoed this, noting that while the survival of carved limestone in that setting surprised him, it does not settle the question of identity. Archaeology rarely speaks in absolutes, Hirt observed. It offers degrees of likelihood and patterns that meet or fail to meet expectations set by texts and other sites. A further layer of interpretation surrounds small ritual traces and marks on the exposed rock surfaces. Early pilgrims reportedly left crosses, graffiti, and votive signs on stones that they believed connected them to the sacred story. The graffiti documented by Martin Vidal and others are consistent with devotional activity, but their chronological placement, whether early Christian, medieval, or later, requires careful epigraphic and stratigraphic analysis. Such marks signal human interaction over centuries, an expression of devotion layered upon an architectural reality that endured beneath it all. The international and interdisciplinary nature of the investigation also matters. Archaeologists and conservators worked side by side with custodians of the site and representatives of local communities to ensure that the procedure respected both science and faith. Professor Antonia Moropoulou was explicit about that balance. Our role is to document and protect. We consult, we sample minimally, and in the end, we reseal what must remain closed for preservation and for the living practice of worship. That resealing was not a retreat from transparency, but a protective measure. The exposed limestone and garden soils are fragile. Exposure to humidity, oils, light, and the faithful's touch could accelerate decay. Before replacement of the marble and final closure, the team had completed high-resolution photography, microscopic sampling, and a rigorous cataloguing of artifacts and eco-facts. The decision to reseal also respects the ethical responsibilities toward a site that is both a place of active worship and a scientific resource. Conservation principles prioritize preservation in situ, and local custodianship must be part of any plan for future research. That is precisely what happened. Detailed documentation ensures that future scholars can re-examine the evidence while current preservations keep the material available for posterity. "We did not remove the stone for display," said the supervising team member. "We recorded it exhaustively and then returned it to its protective cover." If there is a climactic moment in this arc of discovery, it is not a single photograph or a headline claim, but the recognition that multiple independent lines of material evidence converge in a way that is rare. A worked funerary bed beneath a marble aedicule, a sealed garden with identifiable Mediterranean plant remains above a cluster of first-century-style tombs and traces of early devotional marks. Together, they construct a historically plausible scenario compatible with gospel descriptions of a garden tomb placed outside the city walls. This convergence strengthens the place's claim in a way that demands new scholarly attention, new laboratory tests, and further contextual comparison with other urban cemetery patterns around ancient Jerusalem. At the same time, the scientific community insisted on humility. Dan Bahat reminded listeners that Jerusalem's urban fabric is complex and that multiple sites could show similar patterns. Garden spaces, rock-cut tombs, and burial benches are part of broader regional practices. Comparative study, looking at other tombs, gardens, and sites dated to the same period, will be crucial. The team also pointed to competing candidate sites and outlined why the present combination of features at this location places it high on the list of possibilities, but they stopped short of any final pronouncement. "This is a heavyweight claimant," one specialist said, "but not a closed case." The technical work that followed the exposures will occupy laboratories for months and years. Pollen samples will be analyzed under microscopes to produce spectra of plant families indicative of cultivated landscapes or wild flora. Seeds and olive pits will be analyzed for species identification and potential direct radiocarbon dating where preservation allows. Micromorphological analyses of soil thin sections will help reconstruct deposition processes, whether a bed is in situ, whether soil was imported, or whether garden soils formed over long periods. Stone tool marks will be compared with known quarrying and finishing techniques. Epigraphic and graffiti studies will assess the relative chronology of marks on the exposed rock. Each method supplies a piece of the jigsaw, and the combined dataset will help archaeologists refine probabilities rather than create certainties. Public response to the discovery reflected a spectrum: wonder, devotion, scholarly interest, and healthy skepticism. For believers, the exposed bench and the garden provide a tactile sense of continuity, an archaeological texture to a narrative many have known for generations. For historians and archaeologists, the site offers data points for reconstructing Jerusalem's topography and funerary practices around the turn of the era. For the general public, the story crystallizes a larger theme: how the past, when carefully unveiled, can complicate as much as it clarifies memory. The team's messaging emphasized that material discoveries do not coerce faith. They inform history and invite reflection. That balance between wonder and restraint was a theme voiced repeatedly. The discovery invites awe. How many places on Earth hold a layered history so physically palpable that stone and seed can tell overlapping stories? Yet that same awe requires restraint. Archaeological interpretation is an exercise in probabilities, context, and peer review. The team framed the find not as a courtroom verdict, but as a significant, well-documented set of observations that strengthen the conversation between material culture and textual tradition. Looking beyond the immediate scientific ramifications, the work carries implications for conservation, pilgrimage practice, and cultural stewardship. The decision to reseal, to limit public access to the raw exposed surfaces, reflects a philosophy of preservation that must contend with a public that desires proximity. Conservationists urged a mediated approach: share the high-resolution documentation, publish the datasets, allow researchers access under controlled conditions, and invest in long-term preservation strategies. In other words, make knowledge available without sacrificing the material itself. The resonance of this episode extends to how communities remember sacred spaces. Places of memory are living entities. They accrete meaning as much through acts of devotion as through the physical deposits left by centuries of human activity. Archaeology does not displace devotion, it contextualizes it. The records and samples gathered during the October 26-28 operation will feed future scholarship, enabling tests and comparative studies that might refine or reframe the current interpretations. But the resealing guarantees that future generations will encounter the same material record, preserved for further inquiry and for the continuation of living worship. What should ordinary viewers take away? First, that science and faith can be partners in the pursuit of truth. Archaeological evidence does not adjudicate matters of personal belief, but it can illuminate the historical and cultural surroundings of narratives that have shaped millions of lives. Second, that discovery is often less theatrical than patient. 60 hours of careful work, meticulous documentation, and conservative decision-making produced a data set that will be studied for years. Third, that humility is central to scholarship. Even surprising finds come with qualifications and calls for further research. There are also institutional lessons. Transparent publication of the documentation, photographs, stratigraphic records, sample inventories, and methodological notes will allow the wider scholarly community to assess and test the interpretations. International collaboration and sensitivity to local custodianship are crucial in sites where religious, cultural, and scholarly interests intersect. The team's choice to reseal after exhaustive documentation is a reminder that archaeological stewardship often involves resisting immediate spectacle in favor of long-term preservation. Finally, the emotional texture of the moment deserves mention. The conservators who worked under electric lights, the archaeologists who bent to brush away dust, the scientists who handled microscopic pollen grains, all described a sense of reverence. Not religious in the sense of declaring doctrinal truths, but a reverence for the past and for the fragile bridge that links present curiosity to ancient human lives. Standing above a sealed garden or an exposed funerary bench, one can sense a continuity of human care that transcends any single explanation. The findings beneath the marble of the Holy Sepulchre, uncovered between October 26th and October 28th, documented by teams led by conservators such as Professor Antonia Moropoulou and archaeologists including Frederick Hirt, Jody Magnis, Martin Vidal and Dan Bahat, and with garden work led by Professor Francesca, do not produce a simple headline of proof. Rather, they produce an enriched, carefully preserved body of evidence, a limestone funerary bed, exposed in an inner shrine, a sealed garden of olive pits and vine remains, and a cluster of rock-cut tombs consistent with first-century patterns. The scientific community responded with surprise at the degree of preservation and with careful language about what the evidence permits us to say. As the site was photographed, sampled, described, and ultimately resealed, the team left a legacy of data for future research and a renewed invitation to wonder. This discovery exemplifies the way archaeological science can sharpen historical questions and create a stronger, though never absolute, link between text and place. It also models an approach to heritage that privileges careful documentation, collaboration with custodians, and conservation ethics designed to safeguard fragile truths for posterity. What they found beneath the marble did not provide a single definitive stamp, but it tightened the weave of evidence in a way that shocked those who expected only fragments. Science was surprised not because a miracle occurred at the dig site, but because material continuity, stone, seed, pollen, and carved marks persisted in circumstances where many had assumed nothing ancient would survive. That persistence invites more study, careful debate, and, for many, personal reflection on how history and faith meet in the material world. Share your thoughts in the comments. What does this discovery mean to you? If you want deeper investigations into archaeology, history, and the ways science and faith intersect, subscribe for future episodes that will follow the lab reports, scholarly discussions, and unfolding analysis of these extraordinary finds.